Live Thursday. Oh, no, now we're live. There we go. So it's the Thursday evening fireside chat OpenFlip thing. And this week's topic is intentional content. We have April, we have Benjamin, we have Christine, and I think Juan Pablo might jump in. So I'll let you guys just jump straight into the content since everyone's seen all three of you before. We don't need to go through the whole intro thing.
Right.
And I'll see if I can drum up these other people that wanted to join. So, Benjamin, you weren't here yesterday, so intentional content, go.
Just like that. I was putting thoughts together earlier this week, really, about intentional content, and I put together a blog post and a video, posted something to a wiki that I'm using about intentional content, really thinking and shifting it for me to make sense more towards learning, and instead of just content, looking at intentional versus incidental learning, and kind of went on to describe what thoughts that I had about those two aspects. And then when I came across your talk yesterday, I enjoyed it, and because it got me thinking a lot about how to really reconcile this idea of intentional content, and so a lot of what I posted in my blog yesterday about intentional content was really looking at, since it's one of the pillars, right? I read that it's one of the pillars of flipped classroom. I started then thinking, well, if it is one of the pillars, one of the main aspects of a flipped classroom, then I started thinking, well, if in a non-flipped classroom environment, what would be the alternative in terms of content? Would it be less intentional? I mean, this whole idea of intentional is, but it seems all intentional to me. I mean, I guess the thing that I can't get my head around is this intentional, this adjective, what it really means in real practice, and it just seems, I guess that's where some of my back and forth is about actually how to, because I have my own definition, I guess, of intentional when it's in terms of learning, intentional learning. But this idea of intentional content, I would be interested in hearing from others as far as how you unpack this idea of intentional content in both a flipped classroom environment and then the alternative, if we're going to call this a traditional classroom or a non-flipped environment, what it would mean in terms of content.
Might sound like, say, a math class. It's not, oh, we just did chapter 3, so do all the odd number exercises at the back of chapter 3 with like no real reason of why all of them, why the odd ones, why not just one or two. That's what it's definitely not. Let me just say hello to Juan Pablo. Oh, are you still there?
So does that mean that it's less intentional? I mean, I understand what you mean, the difference, and I think we're all on the same page here. I think it's just this idea of intentional. Like, for me, if whatever worksheets that you do in class, for better or for worse, traditional or not, it seems to be just as intentional as setting up videos outside or content outside the class.
I think, Ben, what you're talking about is good pedagogy, and I would love to say that every single teacher in my building, every single teacher that I've ever met has good pedagogy, but I will tell you that that's not what's out there. People, my question to my math department was, if you give a kid a worksheet 1 through 10, for example, 1 being the easiest and 10 being the hardest, problem. If the student can do 1, 5, and 10, those problems, then what's the point of 2 through 4 or 6 through 9? Is it? I mean, and if there is a purpose, then tell the students that purpose. But if the purpose is just because I said so, then that's not really a good reason. So I think that teachers intentionally doing things, now whether it's to benefit the student, that I think is where, for me, that's where intentional content really kind of takes hold, is that you have to really look at what you're teaching and why you're teaching it.
So the assumption then...
Does that make sense, Mom?
So the assumption here then is in class, the content is then less intentional. It's more just but from the book, that type of thing, more automatic. Is that what you're
Right.
saying?
I mean, we all know teachers that just recycle the same PowerPoint, and I'm not dissing on them at all, but that recycle the same PowerPoint without any kind of reflection going into looking at, is this really what's best for my students? Or aligning, looking at the standards and the objectives that they're supposed to be reaching. Is everything they're doing aligning their students to succeed at that level?
Right.
Like I said, I wish I could say that every single teacher in every single place all over the world did that, but that's not the case.
Yeah.
And then we could get to the level of the scaffolding type thing, Benjamin, where we're saying, let's say my son just really gets the topic they're doing in math this week, but he has to do the same 30 exercises as the person beside them that really might get some benefit from those 30 exercises, but my son is like, yeah, I already know this, maybe I could work on some other topic while these other people are doing what they need to do. So there's that as well, because actually that's one of my son's problems was at one school, is they just kept giving him more and more and more and more exercises, and he said, well, why do I have to do all this if I already know how to do it? It just doesn't make sense. And I was actually agreeing with him, but that kind of didn't make my wife that happy.
To me, it would be when they communicate the pillars and they talk about intentional content, that they throw some sort of pedagogical aspect to it, because I agree with all of your comments totally.
Right.
It's the way that when someone reads the pillars, and again, I've just looked at a couple of websites very briefly, but there was not any indication of change in pedagogy. It was just intentional content. Like, that's all it was. And it seems to me that there's a pedagogical piece that could be articulated within that description of that pillar that I think would make it, a little bit clearer. And when someone's reading this, right, that's the whole point, is to be able to really get your head around, or others get their heads around what it is or what it means, this pillar, as far as being part of the flipped classroom.
And I think that's good feedback, Ben. I didn't write this up, but for me, it's the hardest one to communicate, because it either seems so obvious that, okay, let's just go past it and go to the next one, or it's just really not phrased well. And I think
people,
after reflecting on it a lot, it's about making sure everything we get our students to do really has a purpose. And if it's just busy work.
Right.
Yeah.
And let's see if we can get Juan Pablo to say hi. Hello, Juan Pablo. Can you hear us? Can you say hi? He's like having difficulty jumping in and out, so I'm trying to get him. If he is there, I want him to say hi. We'll get him to say hi. Okay, go ahead, Ben.
Just really quickly.
Didn't mean to cut you off.
Go ahead, Ben.
What's up?
Technical fun. Go ahead, Ben.
Oh, yeah. So, the last thing I was just going to say about content, too, is just that also, as we know, content is just one piece of the whole educative experience. It's the input. It doesn't speak much to the actual action or the learning that takes place. I mean, that's another shortcoming of the brief description of intentional content that I came across, was that there's no indication of certain actions or learning by doing, and exactly how students are interacting with that content, that I think would also shed light on certain characteristics that make the flipped classroom, I think, a positive, something that's maybe an advantage over maybe a traditional classroom. So that's something else.
No, that's really good. That's good feedback. I was there when this was all written, and we were trying to stay. I remember getting to this point and having these conversations in a very small room in Washington, D.C., and trying to talk through this. I mean, and just being brutally honest here, to go up to a teacher and tell them that their pedagogy is wrong, not probably the best way to get them on your team or on your side. People tend to get extremely defensive about pedagogy, whether it's right or wrong, and I'm not going to defend one way or the other. But there's got to be a way that you can approach a person without and I think that's why they stayed so general in this area, and that's why it's explored a lot more, and I think it's probably one of the most talked about areas, and that's why the books are out there. Is it's content specific. It's directed toward math and science and English, because that I piece needs to be explored, Benjamin. And you're right.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's hard to say it without kind of offending in these days of political correctness. It's you can't say, oh, your worksheets suck, although that's what we say.
Right.
Well, I think, and as much as you can base it in research and literature and keep it non-personal, I mean, this is not anything personal against anyone, of course, right? This is more just what does the literature say, based on our experiences, what works, and just looking at differentiated instruction. And I talked a little bit about this in an earlier post about the differential learning spaces, really, and I think it relates a little bit to content here, is when you are differentiating content, okay, then how does that, where's the intentionality there when one is differentiating content? Students are choosing for themselves which content is most relevant and that works for them, and so then at what point is it still intentional? Is it intentional on the part of the teacher or on the part of the student or as part of the syllabus or the curriculum? And there's a lot of things.
Or both.
Or all.
Or all or none.
All of the above.
Right. So, it's interesting.
Yeah, it's kind of, if you take it the opposite, it's just like, we'd never say, oh, this is non-intentional content. So, yeah, it's hard that way.
But it could be
we know what happens.
It could be incidental and still valuable. It still could. It could be.
Right, but then I'm thinking those two words are more orthogonal, not opposite.
Right, and that's what I was trying to share in this when I was talking about intentional learning, is that there is some benefit in there, but just how do we as teachers handle that incidental when something emerges? It's not really part of the curriculum. How much time do we spend on that, or tie it into the curriculum or the goals of the activity or whatever?
And that probably goes back to learning culture. Can you hear us, Juan Pablo? It comes in and out and in and out. Okay. And yeah, I think that goes back to learning culture, Benjamin, where when we get at a discovery and it's like, well, I wasn't expecting it to go this way, and all of a sudden let's just go down that alley and explore what the student's bringing up right now, I would say that's definitely the incidental content that comes in, and I want like 95% that. Definitely. While still trying to steer and make sure we're not, studying chemistry instead of biology.
Right, and I think that you're intentionally creating. I think you're intentionally creating an environment where incidental learning can happen.
Right.
If that makes sense.
Yeah, and that does, right? You want to be a catalyst to create those opportunities for accidental learning, and learning is messy, and all of these other phrases we want to use about learning. Juan Pablo's moving now. I'm thinking, no, he keeps going in and then freezing. Internet fails. His internet is like mine, usually, probably. Cool. No, that's an awesome point. Christine, you're like sitting there quietly watching us.
Well, I have a lot of thoughts.
Intentional, the word intentional.
So, be it incidental or intentional, like the question I have is, have any of you ever had students that drive the intentional content? And in the sense that it starts out incidental, but it turns out that what their needs are actually what the curriculum should be, and that you tweak the curriculum over time, and like, what does that look like? Has that happened to anybody?
I'll speak up here. And I'm fortunate that I teach a philosophy class, and there are no real philosophy standards in K-12. So I'm fortunate in that aspect, with that in mind. And so, I've been very lucky that I've provided opportunities, and students have had little epiphanies, and then they go off and research. They come back the next day, and they drive the discussion. So, for example, if we're talking in my class, we talk about the ways of knowing, like how we gain knowledge, and one of the ways we talked about was emotion. And so we're having a conversation, something comes up, the student had an epiphany, and then she went home, and then she came back, and she's like, I found all this information. I'm like, go get in front of the class. Let's see what you have to say, or let's share what you found. And we had this amazing question about rhetoric in the speeches towards the Egyptian or the Arab Spring. That's something she was passionate about. She found it, she researched it, and came in and shared it. So that's one, like I said, but I'm lucky with philosophy. I have a little more flexibility.
And do you see that as an easy fit? Oh, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, and then that's also another catalyst, that most students aren't used to the fact that they can contribute. And when you get that wonderful experience that someone was able to do, then it's going to incentivize others, maybe not even in your course, maybe not this semester, maybe not this year, but later on they're getting that they can be the driver of their own learning.
Right, and do you see
and I've seen that
kind of
2 years later with students.
Yeah.
That came back to me and said, because of what happened in your course, I was able to feel more in control of my courses later.
And like specifically, I know you, April, you teach English. I'm not sure what other subjects people are teaching, but in the department of teaching English to foreign language students, English as a foreign language, I personally see that the students driving the intentional content at times is almost necessary, because we, the teachers, can devise a curriculum or use a curriculum and find out there are flaws in it, and if there's student need, to me it makes sense that will mold and shape over time. Am I all right?
I would say that's not just EFL. I've seen that in every course I've taught. We're like,
okay,
who made these decisions? Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, see, I don't have any for English, but for philosophy, I have no standards. I have no book. I have very vague objectives, so I'm like free in that class. But
yeah, so, in my case, I teach a lot of writing courses, and these are university students who are studying to be English teachers. And the syllabus, we do have a syllabus, and it'll state the grammatical structures, of course, that need to be covered. But we don't start. That's not the entry point for our courses. So we'll start either with usually a product, whether that's some sort of content that they're going to create, if it's a video or some sort of essay or whatever it happens to be, and start with ideas that motivate them. And then as they start to develop their own writing, of course, then grammar emerges and typically is aligned with the program or with the syllabus. But also invariably, things will come up also with, for example, pronunciation, things that aren't really part of the course, that aren't part of the syllabus, that we'll also address. If I see that students are mispronouncing words or whatever, we'll talk about that, and then tie that into the writing and the grammar that we're working on for that day. So that would be kind of an example in my case where incidental learning is then shifted to intentional learning that was generated from the students that essentially aligns with the syllabus. Now, to your question about what we do, we work at the university, and so we have to present to the academy any changes to the syllabus. So after each semester, for example, we will reflect on our experiences and then make recommendations for changes, and then decide as an academia what changes are needed to the syllabus. But we have to really be careful with any changes that we make, and that we can't just make it willy-nilly. We can't change it on the fly. It has to be typically at the end of the semester, and it has to be a group decision.
And what we have like this, I don't know, it's kind of the unspoken rule of the derecho de cátedra, which is like about a 20 or 30% of the course content we can do what we want with, supposedly. But then, and this gets back to Christine, who keeps bringing up the administrative support, is if they've put the syllabus is so packed full of, there's no flexibility for me to do this exploratory or incidental learning, then that's hard too. So that's where things get ugly.
Changes to the syllabus as an instructor of that course?
If you're saying proposal to the syllabus for the semester that I'm teaching with my groups, yes, very much so. If we're talking about, okay, this is what we learned this semester in this course, and we want to change the syllabus for next year, Not so much. We have a pretty rapid change at the Tech. Every 3-4 years we're changing syllabus on programs. But we have this flexibility kind of written in that we have as the teacher of that course in that semester to be able to do things different. And I think that's critical to be able to do good learning. Is what's an awesome syllabus this semester could be completely different to next semester, or to this group of electronic engineers I have versus the art students that are in my group in the other section. It's not all the same. And so we always struggle with that. I have mixed degree students.
Okay. Are they extracurricular courses, or are they part of the curriculum? They're
part of the curriculum.
Okay.
Part of the curriculum.
Interesting.
Yeah. And we're moving towards, and at the administrative really high level, we're moving towards this, what we call Tech 21. But when it gets down to the nitty-gritty details of what the actual syllabus says, and this is system-wide with 31 campuses, it's pretty laid out in stone, and pretty well everyone knows that we just don't follow it completely. It's just you don't talk about it in open. Here we are being recorded. But we know this, and it's been like that for the 20 years I've been in the Tech.
Well, I think, and Ben, to that point, and to Ken's point, I think it's important to have a discussion about the difference between a syllabus and a scope and sequence, because those are two very different documents. In my experience, for me, there's a scope and sequence that I have to live by. I have to do the standard. That's what you're saying. I can't change. But for me, my syllabus is like my day-to-day. How do I meet those standards? I have the choice as to how I meet those objectives and those, whatever you want to call it. But I call it a scope and sequence. So in our district, in our school, we all have the same scope and sequence for every single, let's say, senior English class. Right. We all share this, but our syllabi are extremely different because we have different ways to get there.
What do you typically, April? What do you typically include in your scope and sequence?
Colorado is a Common Core state, and then they added on to it. So Colorado Department of Education actually gave us our standards and our benchmarks, and so I use those standards and I use those benchmarks.
So they come from Common Core, most of the.
Colorado took the Common Core and said, oh, well, we like this and this, but we're going to add on and change this. I don't know. I mean, they made a few tweaks to it. But for the most part, it is Common Core, and not to want to get spam with bad emails, but if you look at the Common Core, which I have unwrapped and rewrapped the standards multiple times for at a district level, I'm okay with it. I think the scope and sequence is appropriate, and I don't see anything wrong with having this unified scope and sequence kind of a thing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then on other levels, Ben and everyone, we actually have departments and courses that are just right down to each exercise and each assignment, and everything is the exact same copy-paste across all groups for all semesters, or all teachers teaching course.
Did we lose Ken?
Yeah, I think he's hung.
Ken is frozen.
Are you back? Ken is frozen. So, but Ben, how does it work with you? Do you have a scope and sequence? Do you have a syllabus?
Yeah, we do.
You're back, Ken.
Oh. Go ahead, Ken.
Am I back? I'm probably because Christine sound like robots. Where was I going with that? So we have this really rigid set of courses where the teachers have to teach exactly the same thing across every section, and then we have this mandate from above that we want. And I had teachers ask me, but Ken, this is what we call departmental courses. How am I going to do this flexible with this rigidity at the same time? And my answer is, we're just going to have to blow that rigidity up. There's no way we can do both. And people were having meetings of how to control the flexible ability of teachers, and it was just kind of like, it's contra against. There's a lot of forces fighting when you get into that level. We're struggling with that definitely in the tech. I just have the luxury that I do whatever I want mostly, as long as I don't get in trouble.
I'm actually
But most teachers aren't in that situation.
Right. When I talk to people, or they send me emails or whatever it is, a lot of the AP teachers will say, "Well, we have such a strict syllabus," and I'm like, "No, you don't. You have a scope and sequence. You're preparing the kids for a test, but how you get them, AP is pretty open as to and so is IB for that matter, about how you get the kids from point A to point B." And Ben, to your point, that's intentional content and everything, and I think really personalized learning comes in this too, where you have to be willing to be flexible to meet your students where they are, and they're going to be in in a 32-person classroom. You're going to have possibly 7 different places that you're going to find your students, and you have to be able to meet them there. And yes, sometimes you have to say, I'm going to do the best thing that I can. I'm going to give them a year's growth in a year's time, but it may not look the same for person A as it does for person B, if that makes sense.
Absolutely, yeah. And I've seen this when I have tried to create videos or content outside of the class that might be considered intentional content, and students reacting and engaging in that same content in very different ways, right? And so part of that too is just accepting that, like you said, we start where they are and accept that not all the students are going to interact with this content outside of the class in the same way.
Right. One of my first years teaching here, and I'm in Colorado Springs, I had a young lady who slept in her car. She didn't have a home, and that person is very different than someone else. And so you have to know your students as a teacher.
Sure. I think Christine had a question about the book driving the syllabus or something. I'm not sure, Christine, if you want to pose that question.
Sure. So there's kind of a debate going on where I'm working, where there's a lot of teachers believing when we teach the new English program that we must have a book to go by. And then there's the thought that, well, we can develop reading and writing standards and speaking standards for each level, and let teachers create the curriculum and teach to the standards that we want covered at each level. What are your thoughts?
I say option B, hands down, is what I would do. And that's the ideal world. My sister teaches in Florida, and now she's an elementary school teacher, and they are so tied to the curriculum down there that for their evaluation purposes, the principal should be able to go from one second grade classroom to another second grade classroom, and they should be only 5 or 10 minutes difference in their reading of the curriculum and going through what they're doing. That's craziness to me. I couldn't do that. I couldn't do it.
Yeah, the book is never a syllabus. Even if you have a scope and sequence in the book, it's not a syllabus. It's a resource. And so any type of program or syllabus that you follow, obviously the idea is to incorporate as many different resources or educational resources that best serve the students' needs.